The city of Boston is a beautiful one and cannot fail, I should imagine, to impress all strangers very favourably.
I love the water. Who could not? This is perfect. This is the way to come in. Eat your heart out, Kate Winslet.
And Boston was the first step of an adventurous journey he undertook in 1842 and describes in his book, American Notes. This city is full of echoes of Dickens' visit. The hotel he stayed in, a remarkable school for the blind, and a rarely seen portrait.
The tone of society in Boston is one of perfect politeness, courtesy, and good breeding. The ladies are unquestionably very beautiful in face, but there I am compelled to stop.
I suppose at the moment I feel as if I'm poetry in motion, because I'm travelling all the time, packing and unpacking, looking at new sights, getting hold of maps and trying to orient myself, jumping into taxis, walking. Boston's a great city, by the way, for walking. And I'm loving it. I don't mind travelling. It stimulates and excites me. I'm not homesick. I don't yearn for England at all. I yearn for the rest of America. I want to see everything I can. And I suspect that that's how Dickens felt. An overpowering, greedy longing to encompass everything that he could.
When I got into the streets upon this Sunday morning, the air was so clear, the houses were so bright and gay, the signboards were painted in such gaudy colours, the gilded letters were so very golden, the bricks were so very red, the stone was so very white, and the blinds and area railings were so very green. The knobs and plates upon the street doors so marvellously bright and twinkling, and all so slight and unsubstantial in appearance. The State House is built upon the summit of a hill, which rises gradually at first and afterwards by steep ascent, almost from the water's edge. In front is a green enclosure called the Common. The site is beautiful, and from the top there is a charming panoramic view of the whole town and neighbourhood.
Dickens was celebrated. It's a combination of a certain amount of awe, a certain amount of, that is, people followed him on the street and famously people snipped pieces off of his coat. People would, if they were simply introduced to him at a social occasion, they would have to put that in their memoirs. At the same time, there was a politeness that he appreciated. That is, there was a sense that he should have some room. There was also a sense that he should be brought everywhere and introduced to everyone who mattered, and also shown everything in the city that was important to know about.
How can I give you the faintest notion of my reception here? Of the crowds that pour in and out the whole day, of the people that line the streets when I go out, the cheering when I go to the theatre, of the welcomes, all kinds, balls, dinners, and assemblies without end.
Dickens was a literary god, as famous in 19th century America as a film star is today. But when he arrived, he was met not by the paparazzi that enrich our lives today,
You have to bend down to me, darling.
but by artists who swarmed all about him, and his image was immortalised in a richer but more old-fashioned style. We are now going into the gallery where will be exhibited, from the vaults, I understand, the only picture of Charles Dickens that was painted at that time when he was 29. I'm told it's a wonderful likeness. I am purple with excitement. Well, I think he looks a bit of a big girl's blouse, actually. He was quite feminine, really. Now, he's right-handed. There's the quill in the right hand. And lovely eyes, you would have to say that. And intelligent, which I would have expected. But it's not clear to me that he's masculine. There's no strength in that face to me. It is the best likeness, we're told, of Dickens at this age. And if we had the sculpture here, which was done at the same time, we would have the perfect likeness of Dickens, the real three-dimensional kick of the man. The painter who painted it, Francis Alexander, was the foremost painter in Boston at that time. And he wrote to Dickens and said, come on, let's be having you. And Dickens said yes. That's the thing that surprises me, for a man who didn't really like to be looked at. And yet, there's a kind of a guardedness in those eyes. They are questioning, and there's a strong gaze. He's looking at you, at me, but he's not telling everything he knows. And that's what Dickens was like. For me, Dickens is the most important writer in the world. Forget Shakespeare, forget Tolstoy. This is the man who put life on a page and created iconic characters. And I cannot understand why he's not on permanent display. We had to ask specially that he was put here, and he's been put very beautifully on an easel in front of some other picture for us. But this picture should be one of the prides of this museum, and I'm going to speak rather harshly to them. Of course, I would have loved to have met him, but I know that he would not have liked me. I'm too fat for Dickens. He liked prepubescent women, and I'm certainly not that.
I wonder about that Boston, the one Dickens knew. How different was it from the city I can see now? Has it the same attitudes, dreams and hopes that it had over 150 years ago?
Some of the things that Dickens saw and reflected upon in the 19th century are still true here today. He came to a city of 100,000 people, but a city that was growing very rapidly and changing very rapidly. A city that had a combination of things familiar to him. He remarks about how much like England Boston was in some respects, but there still was vestige of Puritan old Boston. Boston was, by American standards, an old city, was more than 200 years old when Dickens came in the 1840s. And so there is that sort of combination of old and new. Boston saw itself as the cultural and literary center of the United States, with some justice. A place much smaller than New York or Philadelphia, probably the fifth or sixth largest city in the United States, but a place of great influence, especially in culture and literature, and self-confident in that respect. Perhaps Boston has lost a step of its self-confidence, but its scale is it's built on a human scale. It has a modern financial business district, but most of the city is still built on a scale that people from Europe will find familiar.
In American Notes, Dickens writes about arriving in Boston, and he's very upbeat, he's very excited. He's arrived finally after those 18 harrowing days on the ship. And that kind of brightness is what I find here. There's a clean wind blowing over Boston. And I think that's why I feel Dickens is here, because he prepared me for this. And, of course, my feeling about it is coloured by my knowledge that he loved it. For him, it was the best of all.
Boston is as I would like the whole of America to be.
Everywhere Dickens went in Boston, he was stared at, or pinched, or poked. It was reported he even had his nose tweaked. The fascination with him was endless. I really can't see the attraction of it all myself. While in Boston, Dickens was modelled for a bust by Henry Dexter. So diligent was the sculptor that Dickens would find himself sat at breakfast in the Parker House Hotel, while Dexter paced around him, every so often measuring a part of his anatomy with his calipers. When this charming young sculptor made a bust of me, he used the same techniques. I leave you to judge the results. Dickens made 2 trips to America, the one in 1842 and a shorter trip in 1868 towards the end of his life, which was undertaken to give readings of his works and earn a substantial amount of money. On both trips, Boston was his first port of call in America, and his retreats from the adoring crowds were his hotels. In 1842, the Tremont, now long gone, and in 1868, the now 6-star Parker House, where I reside, only of course in the interests of Dickens' scholarship.
The Tremont Hotel I stayed at on my first visit has now become contemptible. This Parker House is an establishment like one of our Termini hotels, with the addition of an immense quantity of white marble floors. I live on the 3rd story, our 3 rooms together, and have hot and cold water laid on in a bath in my bedroom, and other comforts not known in my former experience. The cuisine is very good. The bar is a large room with a stone floor, and there people stand and smoke and lounge about all the evening, dropping in and out as the humour takes them. There, too, a stranger is initiated into the mysteries of gin sling, cocktail, sangaree, mint julep, sherry cobbler, timber doodle, and other rare drinks.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Fabulous. I liked it. It's fabulous. Do you think that possibly Chuck might have drunk that drink?
I hope he did.
I think he did. And I think he liked it as well as you did.
I'm ready to roll.
Here's a list of what Dickens had to eat every day. At 7 in the morning in bed, a tumbler of new cream and 2 tablespoonfuls of rum. At 12, a sherry cobbler and a biscuit. At 3, dinner time, a pint of champagne. At 5 minutes to 8, an egg beaten up with a glass of sherry. Between the parts, the strongest beef tea that can be made, drunk hot. At 10:15, soup and anything to drink that I can fancy. I don't eat more than 1/2 pound of solid food in the whole 24 hours, if so much. Blimey.
The Parker House Hotel offered Dickens the peace and quiet he needed to prepare for his evening readings, and they have one piece of memorabilia here that reflects this.
This is the mirror that Charles Dickens used to rehearse in front of when he came to Boston in 1868 and performed A Christmas Carol. You're supposed to be able to look into it and see his figure rehearsing. No sign yet.
In its time, the Parker House was the most technically advanced hotel in America. By chance, next door now is one of the most technically advanced hotels in the world, where entry is not by key, but more by personality.
Be checking into our Cloud 9 suite today. Just look straight ahead. Great, just hold it there. This is our camera here, and I'll,
You have to put it lower for me.
a little bit, and if you just put your eyes...
Identification is completed.
Yes, and now the door will open for you.
Gosh, what a view. It's a wee bit modern for me, but I wonder if Mr. Dickens would have liked it. He probably would. He liked the very best.
There is no doubt that much of the intellectual refinement and superiority of Boston is referable to the quiet influence of the University of Harvard, which is within 3 or 4 miles of the city. The resident professors of that university are gentlemen of learning and varied attainments, and are, without one exception that I can call to mind, men who would shed grace upon and do honor to any society in the civilized world. Whatever the defects of American universities may be, they disseminate no prejudices, rear no bigots, dig up the buried ashes of no old superstitions, never interpose between the people and their improvement, exclude no man because of his religious opinions. Above all, in their whole course of study and instruction, recognize a world, and a broad one too, lying beyond the college walls. The bells, when they sounded, told me sorrowfully of change in everything, told me of their own age, and of the many, never old, who had lived and loved and died. The reverberations had hummed, and motes upon the deep of time had lost themselves in air, as circles do in water.
It was unexpected. I didn't quite know what I was going into. And the spareness of it, and the light, and the smoke coming up from the little grills in the pavement. And from afar I thought, what is that? But when you go through that walkway, you do stop and you do think and remember about those people who died all those years ago. It really moved me. It's one of the most powerful and telling metaphors that I've ever seen for that terrible event. And it seems the city of Boston put it up there. They paid for it. I like the city of Boston.
Dickens worried a great deal about the lot of the poor and disadvantaged. Workhouses, schools and prisons often take centre stage in his writings. Indeed, the welfare of the poor and the desire to seek improvement for them was a 19th century obsession. A well-to-do Englishman had to visit, vet and approve such institutions, and Dickens' trip included many such forays. For a well-to-do 21st century actress with a passion for Dickens, those are the bits of his footsteps that must be retraced.
I went to see the Perkins Institution one very fine winter morning. An Italian sky above, and the air so clear and bright on every side that even my eyes, which are none of the best, could follow the minute lines and scraps of tracery in distant buildings.
This is really following in Dickens' footsteps. I'm now making my first institutional visit to the Perkins School for the Blind, which Dickens came to in 1842 and was deeply impressed by.
This is the old curiosity shop written by...
So impressed was Dickens with Perkins that he donated £1,700, that's over £100,000 in today's terms, for copies of the old curiosity shop to be printed. They were set in Boston line type, a raised text that can be read by the blind.
It's such a rich history. 175 years ago, Perkins started as the first school for the blind in the United States in 1829. I am the 9th person to lead Perkins in 175 years. The first one, Dr. Howe, it wasn't enough to set up a school for the blind. He just brought in teachers and materials. That alone was a heroic job. But he went further than that. At the time, the thinking was that if somebody was deaf and blind, not that they couldn't communicate, but they couldn't think.
It is strange to watch the faces of the blind and see how free they are from all concealment of what is passing in their thoughts. Observing which, a man with eyes may blush to contemplate the mask he wears.
That was, quote, what thinking people decided at the time. Dr. Howe said that didn't make sense. And so he put that thinking on his head and said, I'm going to prove that wrong. And through networking and reaching out, identified a young woman, 7 years old, Laura Bridgman. She came here, learned to read and write, just a brilliant young woman, and very, very accomplished. And she went on to teach many of her other classmates as well. And Dickens was struck by her and many others.
I sat down in another room before another girl, blind, deaf and dumb, destitute of smell and nearly so of taste, before a fair young creature with every human faculty and hope and power of goodness and affection enclosed within her delicate frame, and but one outward sense, the sense of touch. There she was before me, built up as it were in a marble cell, impervious to any ray of light or particle of sound, with her poor white hand peeping through a chink in the wall, beckoning to some good man for help, that an immortal soul might be awakened. Her name is Laura Bridgman.
Laura Bridgman, who was the first woman who was deaf-blind, was the most famous woman at the time, except for Queen Victoria. There were hundreds of articles written about her from all over the world. And if you came to Boston in the 1830s as one of the highlights from a, quote, tourist, you would come to Perkins and see Laura Bridgman and marvel at her educational abilities.
Perkins' other famous alumna was Helen Keller. Her mother read Dickens' praise of Perkins and description of Laura Bridgman in American Notes. Helen Keller was then sent to Perkins, and helped by her devoted teacher Annie Sullivan, she too emerged from the darkness. Jamie Lard is a spokesman for Perkins, a living example of what the school achieves. Deaf, blind and dumb since birth, she communicates in the same way as Laura Bridgman and Helen Keller before her, and at a pace I can barely keep up with.
Was Helen Keller an inspiration?
Wow. I feel very lucky, very inspired, because Helen Keller, she did a lot of traveling to different places in the world, and she showed people. And now I'm having the same kind of opportunity to do that. So yes, the inspiration is there, and I see that she and I are the same kind of person in the world. She traveled, I'm traveling. She had friends, I have friends. She had communication. We both signed the same way. We had tactile sign language, and it brought us together with other people.
Ye who have eyes and see not, and have ears and hear not, ye who are as the hypocrites of sad countenances, and disfigure your faces that you may seem unto men to fast. Learn healthy cheerfulness and mild contentment from the deaf and dumb and blind.
They see sign language, they see communication. People see and they get fascinated by that. And they get enthusiastic too about learning more and learning about Perkins. And that's why Perkins is so successful and so famous in the world.
As I rose to quit the room, a pretty little child of one of the attendants came running in to greet its father. For the moment, a child with eyes among the sightless crowd impressed me almost as painfully as the blind boy in the porch had done 2 hours ago. Ah, how much brighter and more deeply blue, glowing and rich though it had been before, was the scene without, contrasting with the darkness of so many youthful lives within.
It's so wonderful to see how your face is alive and illuminated, so that what you're saying is coming through your face as well as through your hands.
It's something that I believe in. I want to teach. I want to teach that. And can I teach you a little bit of sign while we're here?
I'm ready. So this is
how.
Now what was
yes? From your mouth. R. You. I'm fine.
Certainly, the most impressive thing of the entire week has been my visit to the Perkins School for the Blind, just as it was for Dickens. He spent more time writing about Perkins than he did anything else that he saw. Perkins grasped his heart, and I think it certainly did mine. What I saw there moved me greatly, impressed me enormously. The size, the dedication, the enthusiasm, the vitality, the charm of those young people who couldn't see and sometimes couldn't hear or speak, and yet they were flamingly alive, and that was thrilling to me.
All they see at Perkins is possibility. It touched my heart. I'll never forget it.
Music is your art, your glory. Let the human heart rejoice, rejoice. Let the human heart rejoice.
These towns and cities of New England are as favourable specimens of rural America as their people are of rural Americans.
New England lies ahead, as it did for Charles Dickens on his trip to America in 1842. The writer of Little Dorrit and Hard Times was also a journalist, and he was engaged on a great travelling adventure which he describes in his book, American Notes. I'm retracing his footsteps through New England, and in Worcester and New Haven I will see courtrooms and churches, but first I'm taking the Iron Horse, as he did, to visit Lowell, one of America's great industrial centres.
Go right on the other side, okay?
Go out on the other side?
Yes, ma'am. We're not going to Boston quite yet, okay?
We don't want to go to Boston. We want to go to Lowell.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Blimey. That was a bit exciting. I mean, Dickens loved trains, and in 1842 they were a bit exciting. And I must say this was a bit exciting, more than I'd expected, because it came in on the wrong platform. So they very kindly backed it up for me to get on from the wrong side. Well, I'm not sure they would have done that in Britain. But anyway, I'm safely on the road to Lowell.
The train calls at stations where the wild impossibility of anybody having the smallest reason to get out is only to be equalled by the apparently desperate hopelessness of there being anybody to get in.
Thanks very much. Bye.
I was met at the station at Lowell by a gentleman intimately connected with the management of the factories there, and gladly putting myself under his guidance, drove off at once to that quarter of the town in which the works, the object of my visit, were situated.
For Dickens, Lowell was a good day out. Recently built, it was set up as a planned industrial community and was based on the efficient production of textiles. A massive complex of mills, worked by girls drawn in from the surrounding countryside. It all took Dickens' fancy. When he saw it in the 1840s, Lowell was the second largest city in New England and the industrial centre of the region. Now it's a national park, run by the same folks who run Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon.
There are several factories in Lowell, each of which belongs to what we should term a company of proprietors, but what they call in America a corporation. I went over several of these, examined them in every part, and saw them in their ordinary working aspect with no preparation of any kind or departure from their ordinary everyday proceedings. I may add that I am well acquainted with our manufacturing towns in England and have visited many mills in Manchester and elsewhere in the same manner.
Here we go.
Natalie McKnight has written extensively about Dickens, and she's fascinated by the effect Lowell had on the writer.
I like being in this trolley. Did Dickens... I love it. That's such an evocative sound, isn't it?
It's very loud, and I don't think it's Dickensian.
You don't?
I don't think he experienced that toot.
What did he think of Lowell?
He loved Lowell. He said it was the happiest day of his visit to America, which seems strange when you consider it's an industrial city.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things he loved about Lowell was that it was a planned city. And it seemed to embody for him all the promise of the new America. This idealistic sense that you could have an industrial city that was still clean and livable was really matched by the promise of the very young Lowell. He saw healthy factory girls. In fact, when he first entered the factory, they were returning from lunch. They were scurrying up the steps. He was crowded in by all of these, as he puts it, young, attractive, well-dressed ladies. And he several times comments on how robust they looked. So I think he did appreciate their health in numerous ways. And then he also found the air of the mills, at least according to his report, to be cleaner than what he noticed in English mills, which, as we know, he had visited.
I am now going to state 3 facts which will startle a large class of readers on this side of the Atlantic very much. Firstly, there is a joint stock piano in a great many of the boarding houses. Secondly, nearly all these young ladies subscribe to circulating libraries. Thirdly, they have got up amongst themselves a periodical called the Lowell Offering.
They actually wrote stuff themselves and published it themselves.
They produced their own periodical, like a bunch of college girls would. They had stories, they had little memoir accounts in the Lowell Offering. It's very readable. I think one of the things that he learned in Lowell was that you could mix industry and art. When American Notes came out in America, it received mostly scathing reviews because everybody was so insulted after having opened their arms to Dickens and given him their hospitality. They were not prepared to take the kind of criticism he leveled against them. It's not surprising that having given Lowell such a wonderful treatment in American Notes, Lowell Offering returned the favor and also gave American Notes one of its very few favorable American reviews, and it was very heartfelt.
Dickens only spent an afternoon in Lowell, and we had a whole day there. When he went in 1842, it was the high point almost of Lowell. It was when the place was teeming and millions of yards of cloth were being exported all over the world. Millions of bobbins of yarn were whizzing backwards and forwards on those smelly, noisy looms. We went in there and I could hardly hear myself think, the noise was so terrible.
Incredibly noisy. I really need these now. They must have gone deaf.
But for him it was a pleasant, pleasing place. He admired those girls. Actually, we find out afterwards that he was quite wrong. They didn't all have pianos and belong to the library. He had a slightly idealised portrait of them. But dear Dickens, he did in some ways have an idealised portrait of the world. Well, not of the world, that's wrong, of women. He had an idealised portrait of young women. Old fat ones like me, he depicted as monsters. After the industrial campus of Lowell, a bucolic interlude. Here, in a 5-acre field behind a private house, deep in the heartlands of New England, there's a gathering of the faithful, a Dickens barbecue. It's organised by the law professor Bob Googins, and Dickens is celebrated in a curious backyard sort of way over food and drink. Entertainment is laid on, too.
Skirts. Is it a foot or is it a claw?
Dickens belongs to the world. He is an international figure. And we are all partaking of that rich elixir, which is the Dickens imagination. Dickens created a world. It's not our world, but it's very close to it. And in that world are the most extraordinary people. Mr. Pickwick, Miss Havisham, Fagin, Mrs. Gamp. Leave the bottle on the chimney piece and don't ask me to take none, but let me put my lips to it when I'm so disposed, and I will do everything I've been engaged to do according to the best of my ability. It's my favourite character, so I couldn't resist doing a bit for you.
Bob Googins, our barbecue host, uses Dickens in a singular way to teach his students a deeper understanding of the law.
Basically, I try to stress how Dickens used the novel as an instrument of social change. He worked as a law clerk for several lawyers when he grew up. He was a parliamentary reporter insofar as the statutory law was concerned. He observed court proceedings all the time. I think he was probably a very good lawyer. The course that I teach, Dickens and the Law, really tries to get the students to understand that while we are now capable of putting a man on the moon and bringing things back from orbit, that a lot of the social conditions that Dickens dealt with in the 1800s are the same today. In terms of Bleak House and Jaundice versus Jaundice, that great case, there was the so-called rule of 50. And the rule of 50 essentially said that if you could get a case that had 50 plaintiffs or 50 defendants in it, it would last forever. Because the procedure at that time was such that every time someone died and you had to bring a new plaintiff or defendant in to the suit, you had to replete it with respect to that particular person. And the process of doing that, and another person would die, that the lawyers would take the entire estate, and the case only ended when there was nothing left to argue about.
The best place to see American justice at work is in one of its courts, and I've been summoned to a sitting of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts in the city of Worcester. I'm hoping to get off with good behaviour.
To an Englishman, an American court of law is an odd sight.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye, all
There is no such thing as a wig or a gown. The jury are quite at home, and the prisoner is most likely whispering suggestions in his counsel's ear. I quickly console myself. The law is not quite so expensive an article here as at home, and that the absence of some of the formalities which we would regard as indispensable has a very favourable influence on the bill of costs.
I think that Dickens understood human nature as it existed in the 19th century, and that human nature hasn't changed one whit. And I think if you read Charles Dickens and you spend time in court, you see the same characters in our courts of 21st century America as populated the English courts of the 19th century during the time of Charles Dickens.
You've heard the testimony of one witness. Of course, you haven't heard all the evidence in this case.
He understood people in their total being. He had that special gift that enabled him to see below the surface. So much of what we see in court as judges and lawyers are reflections of people's true beings, because we don't see them in their totality. We only see glimpses of them. And Dickens understood that beneath that reflection is a human being with all the same faults and virtues as any other human being. And so in court, the challenge is not to be put off by that reflection or that surface that you see, but to try to see below that, to try to see the character, which of course is so central to determining who's telling the truth and whether they're telling the whole truth or only part of the truth.
Right here, in your attendance, you shall be heard. God save the court is now in session. Please be seated.
Worcester is rich in Dickensiana, and housed in its Polytechnic Institute is the Fellman Collection. Full of rare memories, books and objects connected with the writer, it was gifted after Robert Fellman's death to the care of Professor Joel Brattin.
We have Cruikshank illustration. This is lovely to see from both sides. This is evidently a page of Cruikshank's notebook with sketches and various arithmetical calculations. First editions of the major novels. First editions in parts here, Little Dorrit, Our Mutual Friend.
Yum, yum.
The Mystery
That's
of Edwin Drood.
fantastic. I love these because I really think this is how people should read Dickens to start with. That they should read them the way that they were originally published, not in a great big volume, which makes people frightened to open it up and think they'll never finish.
This is a real rarity, Dickens's last novel.
Yes, I've never seen this in parts.
In the second installment of The Mystery of Edwin Drood, at the back, there's a special insert, an advertisement for cork hats. Very, very rare because it's actually printed on cork.
This is a very vivid portrait of Dickens.
Yes, it is.
Rather unpleasant one, though. He's got a fly on his head.
Yes, he does, and with the closed eyes and the full beard, I think that is a kind of an intimation of mortality.
Yes, you know, when I first saw it, I thought it must have been drawn when he was dead.
It is a peculiarly morbid illustration, I think.
And this terrible little fringe of hair across the top, you know, when people are getting bald, how they do that.
A comb-over. I don't believe Dickens was ever really guilty of that.
I hope not.
Dickens was very taken with some of the 19th century's more dizzy intellectual and scientific pursuits, such as mesmerism and phrenology. Phrenology, the art of reading personality from a head. If you wanted to get ahead in the 19th century, you had to have your bumps read. Now, I don't let anyone near my bumps normally, but in the case of Professor Michael Sokol, I am to make an exception.
Phrenology in America in the years before the Civil War, it was based upon the notion that each individual's had within their mind certain faculties located in a particular part of the brain, and that the shape of the brain determined the shape of the skull that enclosed it. Here, then, is the way in which a phrenologist would approach an individual. One knows her as a distinguished actress, and therefore one immediately knows, in the way a phrenologist would, that her faculties of imitation and individuality are much stronger than that of the normal, everyday individual.
Dickens had his head
Exactly.
examined and felt over.
Yes.
Who did that?
It was done by Lorenzo Fowler. He starts off with some early observations of the size of the skull, strength of the system, degree of activity. But towards the back, I note very, very strong on a level of 6 or 7 faculties of firmness and faculties of conscientiousness. He's very small, relatively small for veneration. He's rated as a 3. But when we get to, for example, sublimity, Dickens is rated as very large, a 7.
What is sublimity?
Sublimity, conception of grandeur, sublime emotions excited by contemplating the vast, magnificent, or splendid nature or art. Finally, if one looks towards the front of the head, one sees a strong faculty of individuality, the ability to project herself, to even in the most demanding roles. One knows it's Miriam Margolyes acting. And with the faculty of individuality, again, we see it as a 6 or 7.
That was rather a flattering analysis.
And that's the way the phrenologists presented themselves, if at all possible.
Next morning, when the sun was shining brightly and the clear church bells were ringing, there was a pleasant Sabbath peacefulness on everything. It would have been better for an old church, better still for some old graves, but as it was, the wholesome repose and tranquility pervaded the scene, which, after the restless ocean and the hurried city, had a doubly grateful influence on the spirits. The Connecticut River was open. The captain of a small steamboat was going to make his first trip that day and only waited for us to go on board. Accordingly, we went on board with as little delay as might be. He was as good as his word and started directly. The Connecticut River is a fine stream, and the banks in summertime are, I have no doubt, beautiful. But at all events, I was told so by a young lady in the cabin, and she should be a judge of beauty if the possession of a quality include the appreciation of it. For a more beautiful creature I never looked upon.
Yeah, I'm familiar with this. Tell me. Christmas Carol, of course, Hard Times, let's see, A Tale of Two Cities.
The sun's on my face, the boat meanders on, the river glides by. Looking out now as I follow Dickens from Hartford down to New Haven, it is as though time has stood still. Where are the speedboats, the expensive villas, the yachts? Perhaps they all heard I was driving.
The boat takes a little bit of time for it to catch up. Once you do it, there's a lag, time delay.
So I should correct it now.
Yes, exactly.
After 2.5 hours of this odd travelling, we reached our destination and straightway repaired to an extremely comfortable hotel.
In New England, the public were as obsessed with Dickens and his visit as ever. Invitations to dine and to the theatre flooded in. People would arrive unannounced in his bedroom, and he and his wife even found themselves being serenaded by the students from Yale.
Thank you, that's lovely.
Bright college years with pleasure rife, the shortest, gladdest years of life. How swiftly are ye gliding by! Oh, why doth time so quickly fly? The seasons come, the seasons go, the earth is green or white with snow. Where'er upon life's sea we sail, for good, for country, and for
Music was a big feature of Dickens' trip. In New England, he was given an accordion, and and spent the rest of the trip playing Home Sweet Home.
Go away!
New Haven, known as the City of Elms, is a fine town. Many of its streets are planted with rows of grand old elm trees, and the same natural ornaments surround Yale College, an establishment of considerable eminence and reputation. The various departments of this institution are erected in a kind of park or common in the middle of the town, where they are dimly visible among the shadowing trees. Even in wintertime, these groups of well-grown trees clustering among the busy streets and houses of a thriving city have a very quaint appearance, seeming to bring about a kind of compromise between town and country. In Hill House Avenue, New Haven has the most beautiful street in America.
It's wet. The sun has lost its hat and the New England summer is ending. On my New Haven porch, where I sit like Grandma Moses in her prime, I'm reminded of a theme that Dickens returns to again and again in American Notes: slavery.
Is it the interest of any man to steal, to game, to waste his health and mental faculties by drunkenness, to lie, forswear himself, indulge hatred, seek desperate revenge, or do murder? No. All these are roads to ruin. And why, then, do men tread them? Because such inclinations are among the vicious qualities of mankind. Blot out, you friends of slavery, from the catalogue of human passions, brutal lust, cruelty, and the abuse of irresponsible power, and when ye hath done so, and not before, we will inquire whether it be the interest of a master to lash and maim the slaves over whose lives and limbs he has an absolute control.
In the cold and wet, there is astonishingly a group from Sierra Leone celebrating the freedom and dignity their ancestors won on this boat, the Amistad. Slaves from Sierra Leone were kidnapped and incarcerated on it. During their voyage, they overpowered and killed the crew. Captured and imprisoned in Boston in 1838, it was the legendary John Quincy Adams who gained them their freedom. This replica of the ship is a potent symbol of a shameful part of American history. The Amistad events happened about 4 years before Dickens came. Why didn't he mention it in any of his letters? I don't understand it, because it was surely an example of exactly that kind of brotherhood and strength that he would have admired. We went on that boat because it symbolized the fight for freedom that he so strongly endorsed. But he himself was quite absent. In another part of New Haven, there is also celebration, this time in a church. Now, as a good Jewish girl, I seldom visit church, but on his visit, Dickens attended many, in particular those that were the most progressive and enlightened of the age. This is a church that fights the corner for the gay and lesbian community. It's a welcoming place of worship, led by the Reverend Susan, supported by her partner Anne. When you're a cultural Jew and you're not absolutely sure that you believe in God anyway, there is a slight reticence about going into a church. I don't want to make a fool of myself. It's all, in a sense, about me. It's not about God. But the strength of the pastor whom I met really impressed me. And the music. If there's one thing that America has given to the world, it is popular music. That is so strong, so including, and I just loved it. And I thought to myself, am I being comforted? Am I being seduced by the childlike delight of it all? And you know what? I don't care.
As you know, an amendment has been introduced into Congress that will define marriage as between a man and a woman. And you know, this situation has the opportunity to either set society back 50 years or bring us into the 21st century way of thinking. As lesbian, gay, transgendered, and bisexual people, we cannot let down our fight for equal rights.
We are about to leave the quiet part of New Haven for New York, the Big Apple. We're going to go by train into Manhattan. We will arrive at Grand Central Station. And if ever a station was grand and central, that's it. And I'm just aching to get there. Polyester cotton. Nice though.